by the way, God calls Ephraim first. Interesting. Ephraim's the firstborn. And it's the first crop to ripen. They're early. Okay. It symbolizes first fruits, early obedience, and covenant sealing.
You are such a badass. I need you to know me. So, back to it.
Hi, and welcome to our Bible study channel.
Energy. Energy. You cannot fuck with this. Energy. You cannot fuck with this energy. Love to all those in the session. All of those who are listening. Don't miss the message, judging me. You cannot fuck with this energy. Energy.
These are videos that go pretty in depth. First thing you should probably do is pause and read our 12 rules for reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules or you don't understand the 12 rules, well, I don't have time to explain them all. Go back to the book that I wrote and uploaded on this channel, which takes you through the entire arc and how we made these quote unquote 12 rules as a framework of what we found after 7 years digging meticulously and carefully through the text. So if you're confused, go do that. If I refer back, well, that's probably because we actually post these things in order. So they're all done in series. And if you jump in at the middle of a series without any schema or background knowledge, and you get all pissed off, well, that's also not our problem. This is a group where we go line by line, scroll by scroll through the text. Warning, we are not language sensitive, so if you can't handle some cussing, it's not the place for you. We also do not endorse nor approve of pretty much any mainstream theology. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. We do a video about the characters that we use in our Bible study series. And the reason we do this is sort of so that they can kind of get in your head. So we do have a video explaining why we chose the people we chose and how their sort of energy characteristics go along with the biblical characters to modernize it for people so they know what the heck we're reading. Clearly, the Roman Church was not doing their job and looking for the lost sheep of the reunited House of David. So that's what we're doing, okay? We're taking that away from them because they screwed it up. The brilliant rabbis also down there in Babylon are also not looking for the lost sheep of the reunited kingdom of David. So you're not going to hear, let's follow Rome. And you're not going to hear, let's follow the rabbis on this channel. Because, sorry, not sorry, but the Bible wasn't actually written for the corrupt Levitical priesthood post-Babylon and Persia to read it through their little janky books. And it also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of pagan 4th century church fathers. So we're not doing that either. You guys can both have a seat. Oddly enough, the Bible also wasn't written to be read through the eyes of some dumbass scholars with pieces of paper that say they're smarter than everyone, but have never seen a Davidic covenant in their life. Not written for them either. You know who it's written for? It's written for the reunited house of David, who are actually in covenant and are actually the sheep. That's who it's written for. That's why nobody else can understand what the heck's going on. What you are going to hear is what you're supposed to hear, which is, let's follow the king. And let's get started.
So, we are going to war.
Oh boy. Oh boy, have a seat. Have a seat. We're doing David's bread in Luke. And this is one of those times. You know, those times where it just goes. So get out your notebooks, pull up a chair, and get really comfortable for this one. And let's just jump right into it today, because we got a lot of ground to cover again. And we're going to go another session on this. Maybe two, hopefully one other after this, but we'll see how it goes. All right, because you guys, David's bread is huge. So let's take a look at our agenda. Remember, we were going to do Luke 6 in 2 segments, and we're just on segment 1, and that has multiple parts. So we did the first part last time, right? And got the Sabbath stuff, arguments out of the way. Okay, moving forward to the good stuff now. We're going to do David's bread, which is probably going to take 2 to 3 sessions. We've got to talk about the key of David, and that's not going to be today. That'll be next time. The presence and the harvest. I think we're fitting that in today, actually. Let's find out. Or it'll kind of merge into today and the next time. And we still got to audit the Son of Man. So, just to start off and remind you guys. Oh, wait, first. We got it wrong. We made a huge mistake, and we want to correct that mistake, because when we're wrong, we are more than happy to say we got it wrong. This isn't a really, really big deal. This is an academic thing, because when I have things swirling in my brain, oftentimes I attribute the wrong thing, and that's what happened here. It was a false attribution. So the first thing we're going to do is say we got it wrong, back up, and get it right. So we talked about last time the second after the first Sabbath, and that's going to come into play today. But that is not in the Codex Bezae. We said it was last time. We said that phrase of the second after the first Sabbath, that's in the Textus Receptus, not in the Codex Bezae. There is an edit in this same exact paragraph that does pop up in the Codex Bezae, which is why I got them confused. But no. The second after the first is actually a difference, a variation in Textus Receptus, which is why you see it in King James Version. And we'll talk about what that means. So Textus Receptus is a series, actually, of kind of printed Greek New Testament texts, because your King James used the Masoretic based on the Greek and the Latin, and the Greek and the Latin here and there and all this stuff to the Masoretic for the Old Testament. And then it used a conglomerate of Greek scrolls to come out with the New Testament. And this conglomerate of scrolls is the Textus Receptus. Okay, so they used the handful of available Greek manuscripts, and this wasn't way until, I don't know, guessing 14, 15, 1600s, whatever the hell it was. So that second after the first Sabbath shows up there, not all the way back in the 4th century or 5th century Codex Bezae. But there is another edit, and that's the one we'll cover today. Okay, I think we got it. So moving on. So I misspoke on that. I attributed the Bezae edit to the wrong, or an anomaly to the wrong anomaly is what we did. But before we get to anything else, as we go through Luke 6, we're going to go pretty deep today. And I just want to do a quick review that the Davidic Covenant is the whole plot of the Bible. Okay. And if you're missing the Davidic Covenant, you're missing the plot. Without it, you're basically stuck worshiping a mascot and waiting for a kingdom that already started without any override authority. So what's missing from everybody out there is no one is auditing the Davidic Covenant as a legal, legitimate, valid, supernatural framework. No one is mapping it against astral breach vectors, supernatural multidimensional authority, or any occult theology. Nobody's doing that either. No one's comparing it to all these glamored constructs like the eternal sun theology or any of the Roman overlays, never mind the Babylonian ones. And no one is treating it as a living covenant that is still relevant today with bloodline enforcement and spiritual jurisdiction. Don't get me wrong. The blood is important. The bloodline is important. We haven't even got there yet. Okay. Because the heir, the king, is the son of David, not some sparkle pants myth. Jesus repeatedly says he's the son of David. He's the root and offspring of David. We talked about that. And he has the key of David. Well, none of that is symbolic, okay? They're making the metaphorical literal and the literal metaphorical. It's all inverted. This is a bloodline claim to the throne that was promised in the covenant, the eternal throne. So the fog-backed BS preachers say it's spiritual. No, it's legal. And the throne is active, unfolding, and still stands today and is just as valid as it's ever been in David's time. The promise is legal, not poetic, not metaphorical. 2 Samuel, we did this before at the beginning when we first started Luke. I will raise up your offspring, remember? I will establish his kingdom. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. That's not metaphor. That's covenant language with eternal jurisdiction. And God didn't say, I might. God said, I will. And boy, does he keep his promises. Now, the covenant collapsed not only with the Levitical priesthood in Babylon that we've been going through the past few sessions of videos and series, but we got to remember, Rome came in and attacked it too with the virgin birth myth, snipped the bloodline. All the Pauline doctrine cut out the covenant. Church tradition took over the throne. And so God looks like he broke his promise to David. David's lineage looks completely irrelevant, and Jesus looks mythological. And this is what they're doing on all of these truther channels out there, comparing quote unquote Jesus, right, to all of these pagan myths, whether it be the Ammon-Re or the Greek. They love comparing him to all the Greek and Roman mythologies, right? Well, that's because they're not seeing him as the son of David, because Roman Pauline theology severed that tie. When you look at the Bible through the lens of Davidic Covenant, none of that's relevant. That's only relevant to Paul and Rome, which drives me bananas about these truther channels and all the scholars that insist on erasing the Davidic Covenant and not starting with that promise as the entire map of the legal supernatural jurisdiction that the Son of David is coming into claim. And so without that lens, you're just lost in apologetics and running from here to there, just buried in edits and corruption. Jesus is the Son of David. He is not an empire mascot. He is not the Levitical Empire mascot, nor is he the Roman Empire mascot. He declared override in Herod's court, survived Roman occupation, called out Babylon's fog, and never claimed mystical divinity or magical sperm. He claimed bloodline authority. He didn't override by magic. It was by covenant, inheritance, and promise of God. But if they acknowledge the bloodline to David and those promises, then every other divine monarchy is just a breach. They're full of shit. They don't have any right to rule. That includes the pharaohs, Caesars, popes, kings by divine right, any glamored avatars and ritual crowns, specially chosen people. If it's not scroll back through David's patriarchal biological bloodline seed to Jesus, they have no right to rule. They can't acknowledge it. Not only does the priesthood fall apart, but all the world's governments and elites fall apart as well. So let's go back here. We're going to remind ourselves what Luke 6:1 says. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. On a Sabbath, remember the first or the second after the first Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence," or it's also called the showbread, "which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." All right, that's where we are. We're just on 5 sentences, guys. And this is why. Remember, we talked about my brain getting flooded with so many packets of information, and I'm trying the best I can, but my brain pulls dimensional pins. Like, you have to think of that conspiracy map, right? With the guy, and he's got all the pins all over the place, and all of these pins start to connect in my brain. And I don't want to lose those pins. So I could go over this really quickly, but I don't want to. I want to show people how deep this goes, but that makes it really, really hard for me to put shit in order and remember to go in order and not forget anything. You guys, from these 5 lines, I had 68 pages of notes to organize and put on a slide deck. So hopefully I've captured the most important and the most relevant of those notes here today and over the next few sessions. So let's get to it. All right, the Codex Vitae mistake, and correcting that mistake. All right, there is an anomaly in Luke 6:5. So after Jesus says, "I'm the Lord of the Sabbath," okay, then it says he's walking along just in the Codex Vitae, okay, it says he's walking along, then he sees the dude working, and he says, "If you know what you're doing, you're blessed. But if you don't know, then you're cursed and a transgressor of the law." Now, the scholars say this has to be like some kind of Ebian or Hebrew-centric Jewish, quote-unquote, legalistic people who put that in there. because it sounds, they're trying to reclaim the Sabbath law, right, under the Levitical system. But I don't really agree with the scholars on this, or at least I question it, because the scholars, again, aren't looking at it through Paul's false, right? What it sounds like to me, if you know what you're doing, you're blessed, but if you don't know, then you're cursed. That's Paul, right? If you break one law, you break all the laws. All this shit comes from Paul. And Paul is the one that teaches your conscience and what you know and believe is what's important. That's why the Gnostics loved him so much, right? So this sounds to me not like a Jesus Davidic thing. This sounds like a Pauline Gnostic insert here. Okay? So Paul's logic is, if you know, you're okay. But if you don't know, you're cursed. Does that make sense? That's Pauline. It's exactly reversed from what they're saying it is. All right, so I don't think that this is Luke. The scholars overwhelmingly also don't think it's Luke, but they think it's a Levitical breach, some sect of Judaism / Christianity, more strict Judeo-Christianity, if you will. Well, I think it's 100% Pauline breach that's retrofitted into the Sabbath scene. But that's me. That's the Codex Bezae edit. And the Codex Bezae is the only place where you see that one. So scholars just say, oh, well, it's contested. And I think they call it contested because if they admit that it sounds like Pauline conscious-based theology, they have to admit that Paul's theology was inserted into override clarity scenes. The scroll was edited and fractured. And so they say, oh, it's a later interpolation. It's unclear where it came from. This is like the same thing you get from doctors when they're like, yeah, the results are inconclusive. Okay. I think it's contested because it's incriminating. So that's that. So in Luke 6, we cross out Codex Bezae because it's Receptus in the feast timeline. In Texas Receptus documents, in many places, we see in Luke 6:1, now we're going to go to the phrase second Sabbath after the first that I originally attributed to Codex Bezae, but it isn't. Got it? It was that secondary Jesus walking in the Sabbath one. But this one, second Sabbath after the first, this is important. And the reason this is important is because it's the Sabbath, which occurs after the big Sabbath. And the big Sabbath, or the first Sabbath, is Passover. So following Passover, the second Sabbath falls right in the middle of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So Jesus is walking through grain fields during this time. So that's giving us a time frame that it is harvest season. And this is aligning with the calendar, the feast calendars in Leviticus 23. So not only is he walking through a random grain field on a Saturday, okay, which is how they're going to read it to you now, or a Sunday if it's Constantinian, or whatever day. Forget the day, okay? He's walking through the grain fields during harvest season after Passover, but during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay, in the middle of harvest season. That means a lot, guys, and we're going to get into that a little bit today. And it's this time that Pharisees accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath law by plucking grain. And he responds by referencing David eating the showbread, or the bread of the presence. But David eating the bread of the presence was a legal override, a covenant override moment that was rooted in covenant priority, not Levitical legal compliance, which is why they don't teach this. Okay, they don't want to talk about David overriding the Levitical priesthood in his time. They want to make it seem, just like Jesus, right, that they're all aligned with the quote-unquote Babylonian Jews with the Levitical law. Jesus is Jewish. Jesus kept the law. Jesus kept the Pharisee law. All that stuff that we've talked about 1,000 times. They did the same thing to David. Okay. They're not going to tell you that Jesus was fighting the entire priesthood and overriding them with covenant, just like David.
We're on easy street, and it feels so sweet, 'cause the world is but a treat when you're on easy street, and we're breaking out the good champagne.
Oh, you better be joking.
And when we sing every sweet refrain repeats right here on easy street.
That's why you see a lot of these anti-Paul channels or Hebrew roots guys still clinging with a death grip on the Levitical law because they're not in covenant. That is my number one way. There's 2 ways that I know that I look for to see if people are in and under authority of the Davidic covenant. A, have they rejected the Roman overlays, all the magical, mystical sparkle dust, right? Have they gotten rid of that part that comes along with Paul and the Logos theory? That's a big one. Do they understand that Jesus is the son of David? That's the very first thing. But after that, they need to understand the override covenant is nothing to do with the Levitical priesthood. And if they don't get that yet, they're not in covenant and they're not reading through a covenant lens. And both parties have a death grip on the Levitical framework, whether it's through their idea of human sacrifice as atonement, from that ritual Levitical sacrifice, blood sacrifice, killing animals, and for Christians, killing human to atone. Okay, that's Levitical and Babylonian. Or they're like, well, Jesus came and did some stuff and he's the son of David, but you got to follow all these Levitical laws because Jesus was Jewish, and so they go to the rabbis. Those are your 2 big breaches out there right now, and no one is understanding the Davidic covenant because no one's in the Davidic covenant, so they're not reading it that way. But it makes so much more sense when you do. It's all very simple, but the priesthood doesn't like it very much. That's why they're never, ever going to teach you this. So Jesus isn't just defending his disciples, okay, for picking grain. He's asserting Davidic jurisdictional authority during a feast that symbolizes covenant clarity, Exodus, and unleavened bread, which is truth over false teaching. And we'll get to all of that right now. The Feast of Unleavened Bread that Jesus is walking and moving through that occurs after Passover, the second Sabbath after the first. This is a covenant-rooted celebration of freedom from bondage. And that's the day that the Pharisees are confronting him in Luke 1-5. So avoiding leaven and remembering the override that broke the grip of Egypt and seal the people into covenant jurisdiction is the whole frickin' point here, okay? And whether you want to think of Egypt as symbolic of worshiping false gods, corrupt systems, corrupt government, corrupt priesthoods, all that stuff is Egypt. Whether you want to believe literally of the literal Exodus or you want to believe in a spiritual Exodus, I don't care. As long as you understand that everything about Egypt and the Exodus is the override and a freedom from bondage. That's the key. And that's what's being celebrated with the no leaven. And we went through the no leaven thing all the way back in our Saul series in the Bread and Kisses video, right? And the difference between the leaven. So this origin of this feast comes straight from the Exodus. It begins the day after Passover and lasts 7 days. And it ends leaving Egypt in haste, so there was no time for the leaven to rise. So Jesus is walking through the grain fields is being done on this day that commemorates all of this crescendo into the second Sabbath, right? Of going through the whole thing of the unleavened bread and understanding all that. And then Jesus comes in on that second Sabbath at the end of this festival with his override. Guys, it's got a lot of symbolism. Since there's no leaven, right? They didn't have time for the bread to rise. They had to just hurry up and leave. That's no delay. So you have to be ready to move when the override hits. Leaven represents false teaching. This is per Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, all of them. This is not leaven, is not sin. Only Paul frames it as sin. Leaven, according to Jesus, is false teaching. And we made that very, very clear in the Saul series, Bread and Kisses. Go back and see that. So we're going to read it the Jesus way, not the Paul way. So eating unleavened bread, this is embodying clarity, urgency, and covenant obedience in that Davidic covenant. Now, Egypt is your dimensional metaphor for slavery, corrupted systems, both government and priesthood, and false gods. This feast marks a jurisdictional exit, not just physical escape. You're changing kingdoms, you're changing jurisdictions, you're crossing over, Hebrewing over. All that comes into play here, right? With true teaching. It's a celebration of override because you're in God's covenant. All right. Now, the covenant sealing, okay, is also here because Exodus 13 calls the covenant sealing, the sealing in God's covenant, as a quote unquote, ready for this one, sign on your hand and reminder on your forehead, which is exactly the language echoed in Revelation, where everyone says Bill Gates is going to come and give you a tattoo. Okay, but that's not what it is. It's about covenant sealing or not. You're either in the Davidic covenant, in God's covenant, in that sealing, or you're in the sealing of the world, the Babylonian systems, Mystery Babylon's system, Rome or Babylon. Israel tends to be running off with Rome, and Judah tends to be running off with Babylon. So northern kingdom-ish people out there in the world, mixing their bloodlines, that would be Rome. Judah kingdom people, many tribes down there too, not just one, tend to be in Babylon still. So that's sort of generally how I think of it, just for a quick rule of thumb. So this isn't just remembering, it's a legal marker of covenant alignment and a move of that legal jurisdiction that we talk about all the time. So Exodus is your sealing, and it's echoed and inverted in Revelation, right? With the hands and the sealing on the hands of the head of Babylon. And you must join Babylon or else. We have a connection to the harvest here because this all is happening. He's walking through the grain fields during harvest season. Well, it's not the wheat harvest. This is the barley harvest, which comes before the wheat harvest. The wheat harvest comes around Pentecost, and we're well before Pentecost. So this is the first barley harvest, okay, right after Passover. And this is the first fruits offering that aligns with the resurrection themes. Jesus is walking through the grain fields in Luke 6 is a jurisdictional audit in real time. He's not gathering all of the wheat yet. He's not separating the wheat from the tares yet. Jesus is dealing with his first fruits, right? The guys who were early, his apostles, are the ones. Notice that Jesus is not the one handling the grain. The apostles are. Those are the early guys, the ones who came early. That's the first fruits, the barley. And they're the ones handling the grain because they're going to be the ones sending out the message and giving the unleavened bread teaching. Am I making sense here? I hope all these metaphors are clicking for you. So this isn't historical, it's cyclical. Every generation must audit their own Egypt, find the covenant, and walk unleavened. This is a kingdom rehearsal override. It's not just a nostalgic ritual. This whole scene is the scroll and the covenant's way of saying, when the kingdom moves, don't bring the leaven of false teaching with you. You better move fast. You better stay sealed. Be early, like the barley. And remember who got you out.
It's our moment in the sun, and it's only just begun. It's time to have a little fun. Move your body to the come and see why you should be on
Lady
me.
nuts on you coming in all kamikaze.
Yeah, we got a front row seat.
Easy, peasy, lemon squeezy.
That can't be beat right here on Easy Street.
And remember the leaven. We audited this before, all the way back in Saul of Tarsus series when we did the bread and kisses video. Paul calls leaven a metaphor for sin and malice, which, I mean, technically it is because you're false teaching, right? So that means if you're false teaching, you're out of covenant, and that would be sin. But he's urging believers to be unleavened as a symbol of purity and moral behavior. And this aligns with churchianity's sin-based theology and long list of behaviors that you're not allowed to do. But it doesn't align with the way Jesus used leaven. Jesus defines leaven as false teaching, hypocrisy, glamour, doctrine. He literally says leaven is false teaching, dipshits. Like, straight up, he says it. You don't have to guess. Okay, he literally says it. Leaven is false teaching. So it's like he defines it himself. It is not impurity in the way that sin is. Okay, but false teaching would be out of covenant, right? You want to stay in your covenant. You don't want to teach falsely. So in that way, it's sin, but it's not the sin the way the Christians think of it. So we have an override of Paul's entire metaphor, and we already did that many, many moons ago. So why is this a big deal, though, for Luke 6? Well, the churchianity claim is that leaven is sin, but Jesus says leaven is false teaching. Churchianity says, oh, the feasts are just symbolic. Don't worry about it. But this feast of the unleavened bread, right? The uncorrupted teaching, this is a covenant audit of the system and the priesthood. Churchianity says Paul has the final word. Jesus is the override authority, not Paul. And Jesus isn't going to come back and change his mind. Okay, it's not going to happen. Churchianity says, well, Sabbath is ritual law, blah, blah, blah. But no, the Sabbath in Luke 6 is talking about a jurisdictional moment in time. You know, everyone gets so caught up on, that's why we did it first. And we just got all the Sabbath arguments out of the way because there's something so much deeper here with Jesus's jurisdictional override moment. And they say, well, David was an exception. No, David was the precedent of the covenant that Jesus is following in the footsteps of in an even greater way, greater than David even. So he wasn't breaking the law. He wasn't breaking God's law, that's for sure. He was enforcing the covenant during a harvest feast, the unleavened bread harvest feast after Passover, in walking through the barley fields, the first fruits, using David's override to expose the Levitical priesthood. That's what's happening in this scene, guys, and it's fantastic, and it gets better. It gets better. So let's do a quick barley versus wheat. The barley is an early spring, March, April, and it's the Passover and unleavened bread. And then the wheat comes along. The wheat harvest is in late spring, so May to June, and this comes around Pentecost. Barley is the first crop to ripen. And by the way, God calls Ephraim first. Interesting. Ephraim's the firstborn. And it's the first crop to ripen. They're early. Okay. It symbolizes first fruits, early obedience, and covenant sealing. So if you feel crazy and everyone wants to argue with you all the time, don't worry about it. You're not crazy. You're early. The wheat ripens later. And this is symbolizing refinement, judgment, and full kingdom ingathering. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening here with those symbols. So, I tell people to be wheat. Well, if you can, try to be barley, right? Because barley's even earlier than the wheat. And sometimes wheat can be wheat, and they just can't hear yet. They're not ready. They're not ripe enough to have their ears opened yet, because we might be still in the barley harvest. Does that make sense? And then the wheat will come along when they come along. Let's hope that that's what's happening, because as I look out there to try to find other Davidic Covenant people, I'm not seeing a whole bunch of them. So I'm like, okay. We don't have a whole lot of wheat going on right now, but it could be the barley. It could be the time in the cycle of the barley harvest. And barley they have humility, they're early responders, and they have covenant clarity. First to be sealed in the cycle. This isn't a one-time gig, okay? It's harvest cycles. And then wheat shows abundance. It's when it's when the harvest is maturing, and it's the final harvest. Like, you better get in or else. Get in that damn barn, right? The wheat and the tares. She's like, go over in my barn. So barley was a humble grain. It was used by the poor and in offerings. So kind of bottom on the totem pole, like you're in a shit ton of trouble, lowest of the low, bottom of the barrel, you're barley. And boy, can I tell you, yes, indeed. Wheat is more prized, and it represents a full provision and kingdom fullness. And that comes out of Deuteronomy. But Jesus tends to dig through the bottom of the barrel first before everyone else joins the party. All right. So barley is your early override. Jesus walking through the grain fields. He's doing a jurisdictional audit during covenant feast time. And these are people that are sealed early, like Noah. Remember, Noah was all by himself for a really damn long time, right? Ruth, the disciples are examples. James says we're a kind of a first fruits. Remember in the letter of James, he goes, we're sort of first fruits. Paul calls Jesus the first fruit. No. No, the barley is your apostles. James is like, we are the sort of first fruits. We're the ones that are the early override. And then they spread the message. They teach the covenant. And then the wheat comes into harvest. The full, massive pouring out of the wheat comes into harvest. And that's the final ingathering. And that comes with Pentecost, spirits poured out, scroll activation, audits begin. So the wheat harvest is those refined through covenant cycles, and they're ready for deployment. All right. So scroll back to audit on the leaven, the mustard seed, and the breach. We did this back in Saul, but I want to just mention this again. Of leaven is false teaching. I have to just hit this home, right? Leaven is also hidden subtle, and spreads quietly, like an infection, like a cancer. And Paul's metaphor reframes this as sin. But Jesus never uses leaven in a positive way. Okay? So what you have to understand is all of these preachers out there are talking about leaven suddenly being good, right? Like, oh, what's the kingdom of heaven like? Oh, the kingdom of heaven's like a mustard seed. It grows and grows and grows. It's a tiny little seed of faith. And it grows and grows and grows and becomes this giant tree. And the birds of the air nest in its branches. No, that's not a good thing. Okay? The birds of the air are coming. They're breach agents, right? In Mark, the birds are the one that snatched the seed. In Job, we have the birds feasting on the carcass. Even Jesus says where the carcass is, where the birds are, the carcasses, right? Birds are not good. Birds are tearing apart the carcasses of the dead. Both in Job and Jesus refers to that. And the birds are snatching the seed off the path. Birds aren't good. You don't want them in your branches. You don't want any birds around. Okay? So leaven, the kingdom of heaven's like a mustard seed. That means it's corrupted. Okay? There's very few. The road is narrow. It's been overtaken. There's an insurrection happening, if you will. He's talking about, like, look around. Where's Jesus standing? He's standing in the crazy ass Levitical priesthood world with the Hasmoneans who went into the Herods, right? And then you got Rome, and you got all this janky ass everything has taken over. He's not looking around saying, it's great. No, the kingdom of God is under insurrection. That's what's happening. The bird's nesting is infiltration, not celebration. So your mustard seed is, yes, it's small, and yes, it's fast growing, but it's wild, dude. It's not a stable tree. He's warning that the kingdom's been corrupted and hosting the birds. And Luke says it's like leaven that the women hid. Hidden is not transparent. The spread is uncontrolled and unseen. And this is how it echoes James with the snowball effect, with desire leads to sin and sin leads to death. This is false teaching creeping its way and hiding its way into the kingdom of God. That's what this is. The woman hiding the leaven in the flour is your janky ass preachers. That's what that is. Hiding false teaching and is an insurrection of the kingdom. So this isn't a, yay, the church grew. No. Their BS reading is leaven is kingdom growth. No, it's hidden false teaching. To them, the mustard seed is church expansion and expansion of faith. No, it's unnatural growth in inviting in the powers of the air, the birds of the air that feed on the carcasses of the people and steal the good seed off the path. They think those birds are a happy inclusion in this pretty meadow picture. No, they're the powers of the air, the breach agents. They teach hidden leaven as subtle grace and church growth is success. But if you're aligned, the church growth, that's just breach multiplying itself through institutionalized religion. It's not covenant aligned. So this is why Jesus tells people to follow the narrow gate. The narrow gate follows the leaven warning. Okay? Leaven isn't kingdom growth. And mustard seed isn't church expansion. They think the narrow gate is some kind of salvation metaphor. The narrow gate is auditing your covenant and making sure you're in it. The church thinks many will enter. Jesus says few will find it. The church says Jesus wants everybody, just invites everybody. He might invite everybody, but he's only stealing very few. As a matter of fact, he's sealing so few that it boggles my mind that Christians think that, what is it, 2.6 billion people Is that how many Christians there are? 2-3 billion Christians in the world? That's a narrow gate. Think again. Something's wrong. Okay. 3 billion Christians, 2 billion Christians does not equal a few that find it. Now, let's go back to this little Exodus piece I threw out there. You're going to find that in Exodus 13:9 and 13:16, it'll be a sign in your hand and a reminder on your forehead that the Lord's law, not the priesthood's law, not the Levitical law, God's law, is to be on your lips. What is his law? That would be the 10 Commandments, right? But in heart, mind, spirit, head, everything you do, right? You're just completely in line there. And that, believe me, getting completely aligned, not like a checklist, but really living those out can be an exercise in constant personal improvement through your whole life. So your hands as your actions, what you're doing is reflecting your covenant alignment. Your forehead is your identity and your consciousness, what you are and what you think is sealed by law. And your lips are what you speak, confirming your jurisdiction or not. So this is forming your dimensional signature. Your covenant's not just belief. It's enacted, it's embodied, and it's broadcast right out from you. So the context of all this, the context of this, believe it or not, is the feast of the unleavened bread immediately after Passover. Not kidding. You can't make this up. It's fantastic. And then we have a counterfeit, which is our Revelation 13. And he causes all to receive a mark on the right hand or forehead. That's allegiance to the wrong kingdom. It's not a random placement. It's a direct inversion of Exodus covenant sealing. This beast, your mystery beast, mimics all the covenant markers of God to claim jurisdiction over people's actions and identity. You've got the economic enforcement and political enforcement of breach allegiance. This is why people are persecuted. They're persecuting you into the breach. And then Revelation 14 comes in and flips the script. Because I looked and behold, the land was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 having his father's name written on their foreheads. So the true covenant seal is sealed in the name and the covenant, not the number of the beast. It is your allegiance to the Davidic kingdom or not. There it is. But the word here I really want to pull your focus into for a little bit is Mount Zion. Put a pin in that. That is the courtroom of God. That is where God's covenant comes from. And we're going to audit Mount Zion and the city of David, which is not Jerusalem. And that's coming up in the next little bit. If not today, then the next session for sure. So back to Luke 6. We've got David and the priestly bread or the showbread. This is where you can find this story, guys. And go ahead and read it on your own. We are going to read this next time. We're going to do a whole David segment, right? We're going to branch off into David world a little bit here. But you're going to find just this part of this consecrated bread in 1 Samuel 21. And the context here is David is fleeing Saul, who we know is the Old Testament mirror of Saul of Tarsus. He arrives at Nob and asks Ahimelech for the priestly bread. It's normally reserved for the priests, and he gives it to David. But he has to confirm that the men are ceremonially clean. Okay, this is what's being referenced by Jesus in Luke 6, when he defends his own disciples for plucking grain. And he's linking David's override moment to his own. And we've seen in the last few sessions how Jesus is trolling the priesthood, right? And bitch slapping him and doing his override. Well, David did the same thing. And that's why it's really hard to understand Jesus if you don't understand David first. So that's why we're going to come to a screeching halt here. And we're going to go back to David for a session or two and really get a feel for this part of David. Because the Davidic Covenant is like a jurisdictional nuclear weapon. It just detonates everything around it. It gives you eternal throne, which is a non-transferable authority. The Son of David is the override heir with legal standing across dimensions. Eternal, right? And it's a covenant. So it's scroll anchored. It's promise anchored, not dependent on a ritual. So once that covenant is restored within a human soul, every glamored priesthood and empire completely loses jurisdiction. And nothing can stand unless it's truth. Because God is the God of truth and God is the God of covenant. So when you're walking in covenant, all of the false teaching and the bullshit and the priesthood rituals and the government BS just falls off of you. Now, that doesn't mean that you have a wonderful life, right? And everything's perfect. That just means you're walking in wisdom and truth and you're holding fast to your covenant and you're not going to be deceived because, well, you're in the covenant. Your priority now becomes not what do I believe, but how do I walk? How do I walk in my covenant? I don't want to get out of covenant, which is exactly how David prayed all the time. I think it's 119. Go there. Psalm 119, I think. All right, let's keep going. So what you're seeing here in Luke 6, this isn't just a squabble about when the Sabbath is, although that's where everybody loves to focus. This is a full-blown covenant audit involving the bread of the presence, the barley harvest, the timing of the harvest, the Davidic override, post-Passover, unleavened bread, and jurisdictional authority. He's not just defending his disciples. He's declaring dimensional legitimacy under the name of David. The bread of the presence. What's that? Oh boy. All right. The bread of the presence deals with covenant ritual and symbolism. So it means bread of the face or bread of the presence, meaning bread of God. So there were 12 unleavened loaves of bread. And these unleavened loaves were placed weekly on a golden table in the holy place. You're going to see this both in Exodus and Leviticus. So the bread of the presence is something that's happening all the time. And this is a weekly thing. But right now, where Jesus is walking through, this would be happening during the second Passover after the first, which is even bigger. So it's like after Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we've got the weekly switching of the bread of the presence. Does that make sense? So this is a big holiday. This is a big Sabbath. And the 12 loaves represented the 12 tribes that were always before God's face, or a perpetual witness to covenant. But we know that every single tribe didn't hold the line and screwed it up, except for that little tiny remnant slice of Ephraim. Not Ephraim total, just that little slice left down at Rachel's burial site. The Ephrathites were the only ones that held the line, and all the other tribes fucked it up. So the only tribe that was left was David's, that covenant witness. But the theory was that it was all the 12 tribes, and only priests could eat it, and it had to be eaten in a holy place. You're going to see this in Leviticus 24. And weekly, on the Sabbath, the old bread was replaced with new bread, always unleavened. But the old was replaced with the new, so there was a weekly covenant renewal. Make sense so far? That's what the bread of the presence is. And what it symbolizes is God's provision. Remember the manna from heaven, unleavened? God's presence and the tribal alignment before God's face, holding that covenant. That's the Levitical ritual meaning behind the bread of the presence. Okay? So what David did in 1 Samuel is he's fleeing from Saul. He asks Elimelech for the priest's food, Ahimelech. I always get Elimelech and Ahimelech confused, but this is Ahimelech. He asks him for food. The only bread available is this weekly bread that's going through. The priest gives it to David and his men, not just David. Just like Jesus isn't the one collecting the grain. He's giving it to the men, right? The men are doing the barley. So it's technically unlawful. But David doesn't care. He is not following this law because David knows he's in covenant. So he's claiming covenant override. I'm legitimate because I hold the covenant. That's what David's saying to the priest. And he's like, up. Okay, David, we gotcha. But are your men, quote unquote, ceremonially clean? Now, this means abstaining from women, and we'll get to that in a minute too. David confirms, yes, we are. And this abstaining from women means, have you had sex? And you have your men have sex. And this isn't about sexual sin. Catholics looking at you. This is about ritual readiness to handle holy things or things that are set apart for God. We're going to talk about why this deals with sexuality coming up. So put a pin in that. We'll get to that today. So to recap, we've got our barley harvest, or our first fruits timing, which is that first grain to ripen, which makes sense because he's walking in the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and he's doing it with his apostles, which are the first fruits according to James. This is tied to Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We saw that. And they would wave a sheaf of barley, and this symbolized covenant obedience and covenant provision. So Jesus walking through the grain fields is barley season, not wheat season. This is early override timing, not final gathering. So he's doing an audit, not a harvest cycle. The disciples are plucking the grain because they are being given that early override, right? That early obedience, the early provision. Okay. He's not harvesting. He's overseeing. He's teaching. He's bringing into covenant. He's proclaiming the kingdom of God. He's teaching them the rules of the road to enter into Davidic covenant so they can then go out, right, and start gathering the harvest and getting the harvest ready for Jesus to come in with the angels and do the harvest with the wheat and the tares. Does that make sense? It's step by step and it's cyclical. Disciples are equivalent to David's men, and Jesus is equivalent to the Davidic heir. And the Pharisees are accusing them of breaking Sabbath law. So Jesus responds with David's override. He's not just defending his apostles. He's declaring himself the covenant heir and greater than David and greater than the priesthood. That's what he's doing. He's like, that David did it, and you don't bitch about that. I'm even greater than David because I'm his heir. I'm the Messiah. I'm the guy. If David did it, you don't think I'm going to do the same darn thing? We're talking covenant here, homies. And by the way, the priesthood detonated. That's what's happening. This is the Davidic heir coming out of nowhere. It's like that scene in the movie where it's like, whoa, I thought that was, they were dead. I thought that lineage was snuffed out. And in walks the heir and everyone shits their pants because they're like, oh, it was real. Here he is. Oh my gosh. You know, they've been, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Well, the mice have been playing. Okay. They never thought the Davidic heir, the cat, would come home. Daddy's home, knock, knock. That's where we are, standing in the grain field. And he's just on the barley. It's early. We haven't gotten to the wheat yet. So it's a dimensional audit. He's invoking David's override. And he's declaring himself as the one with authority to feed his own covenant override Davidic kingdom agents, even with bread reserved for priests, even with teaching reserved for priests. So it's important to remember the bread of the presence that David took was unleavened, despite being called quote unquote bread. And you can find this again in Leviticus 24, which describes the bread as being made from fine flour, which is good flour. It doesn't mean like tiny fine, right? It means good fine, like very, very fine, very good, very high quality flour, baked into 12 loaves and placed into stacks and covered in frankincense. There's no mention of leaven. There's no rising agent. There's no fermentation. And this all aligns with the ritual purity and covenant symbolism. Leaven would have violated the sacred function because remember, the 12 loaves of the showbread or the bread of the presence are representing the 12 tribes who are supposedly holding fast to that covenant before God's face. So you don't want any false janky ass leaven, false teaching and janky ass leaven in that bread because they're supposed to be holding the line. Hint, hint, they weren't. But according to the Levitical priesthood, that's what it symbolized. So our leaven is the false teaching. Mixing leaven into the equation would symbolically taint the whole offering. Then we get to David's override, where he and his men eat the bread of the presence during the barley harvest. The priest checks if they're clean, not just physically, but ritually aligned. This is what Jesus is referencing in Luke, also during the Feast of Unleavened Bread while walking in the barley field. But Jesus doesn't pluck the grain his disciples do because he's not harvesting yet. He's authorizing override to the barley, to the early, to the ones that get early provision, just like David. The grain isn't even ripe for the full harvest yet. It's first fruits season. And remember, this is also interesting. When David took the bread, he was still on the run, right? He was on the run by the corrupt King Saul. He wasn't in his full covenant kingship yet, right? He wasn't a ruler of anything. He's still on the move, on the run, but in covenant. Same with Jesus. Jesus hasn't opened the kingdom yet. He's still navigating the waters of the corrupt system. So these two things have so many parallels. I could go on for years. So why no women? What's with the no woman thing? Well, this also goes to 1 Samuel. David asks for bread, and the priest says, there's no common bread, only holy bread, if you've kept yourselves from women. Why that? And David replies, indeed, women have been kept from us. The vessels or the bodies of the young men are holy. This isn't about misogyny or moral judgment or fornication, okay? This is about ritual readiness to handle sacred objects. Now, why is that important? Specifically, sexual activity. Back in the day, here was the thinking. And we're going to compare this to pagan temple thinking that you'll see also back in the day and today, hint, hint. But sexual activity believed to render a person temporarily unclean under Levitical law. Now, this doesn't mean sinful. This means ritually unready. So there was a required waiting period after you had sex, and you had to wash before you could re-enter into sacred space. Okay? So you don't want, we'll get a little graphic here. You don't want to be laying there with bodily fluids exchanged all over yourself, right? With the semen and the hoochie and the sweat and all that stuff all over you. Okay? It is a bodily cleanliness thing on one level. The other level deals with the mixing of another person's fluid, and also spiritual energy is there too. So you can think both in the physical and in the spiritual for this framework. Okay. So because the bread of the presence was reserved for priests, giving it to laymen was an override moment. But he wanted assurance that they're clean enough to handle it. So abstaining from women was sort of the shorthand for ritual purity, especially in war or sacred service. So why did they do war prep? Before meeting God at Sinai, Moses says, do not go near a woman. 2 Samuel, Uriah refuses to be with his wife while his men are at war. So it's an abstaining during wartime. Okay. Israel fasts and abstains before battle in Judges. So sexual abstinence shows ritual discipline, focus, covenant, and dimensional readiness. You're focused and ready for war. So why didn't he ask about blood or unclean food? Well, those are longer term markers. So touching blood, you'd have to go through a whole 7-day purification. And eating unclean food, well, that was breaching the unclean food dietary law, not just temporary impurity. And the unclean clean food dietary law is a different thing than don't eat food sacrificed to idols. Okay. Eating food sacrificed to idols, there's no ritual to get over that. All right. You've got to just repent, have mercy, and come back into line with the covenant. Because once you're out there eating food sacrificed to idols, you're breach covenant, right? You're breaching your covenant. And so you've got to come back into line with your covenant. So his question about immediate readiness, this is a common war protocol, and it's a short-term way to show that you're standing in that purity. It's the fastest way to confirm cleanliness to get override access. Because I think there was only 24 hours or like you till that evening. So if you had sex that day, you had to wait till the evening, but it's like one day. It's like really fast. Go clean yourself up, take a nice hot shower, wait a little while, and you're good. Okay. It's that recovery period or a reset period to be clean and also to separate from the energetic field of the other person. Okay. And I know you guys understand this, right? Because you can just walk in and sit down in a room and you can feel people's energy, right? It's totally different than when you're sitting alone. So then when you have sex with someone, all of that spiritual energy, their attachments, all that's slathered on you, and it takes a reset to disconnect from that piece. That's really what this is about, because they can't, if you've got a non-covenant person, woman, or pagan hoochie slathered all over you, right? You're in breach. You've got that spiritual energy and also the uncleanliness just from the bodily fluids that is making you an out-of-covenant person mixing with a covenant person, if you will. So the easiest way to be like, no, I am holy myself. All my DNA, all my cells are intact. I don't have any janky-ass spiritual energy slathered all over me. And by the way, I'm clean. That's why it's a sexual thing. So whether alone or with a woman, you're unclean till that evening. And it requires not only washing yourself, but your garments, and then you're ritually clean. So it's basically a one-day deal. So the priest isn't asking them if they're sinful. He's asking, are they ritually ready to handle something sacred? And this guarantees cleanliness without needing a bath or a waiting period. So that's why David replies, nope, we're good to go. Give me the frickin' bread. They're clean, they're ready, they're override covenant people, standing in covenant purity and ready to go. Their spiritual space has not been breached, and their bodily space has not been breached by anyone else. So bodily fluid is your sacred space, which is dimensional saturation. Okay. This applies, by the way, whether you're with a woman or you're having fun by yourself. And it's not about sin, it's this energetic saturation. Bodily fluids, you guys, you have to understand blood, semen, sweat. Bodily fluids are life force markers. And boy, we haven't talked about yet that, but we will. This is one of the reasons is the blood. Okay. Your life force is in the blood. This goes straight into paganism. Is why they're drinking the blood, right? The life force is in the blood. It's what changes from human to spiritual. What's the difference? What's that piece that separates humanity, Adamic humanity, with non-human entities? Well, that piece is the blood. The life force is in the blood, which takes us all the way back to the garden and what happened in the garden, and takes us right into Leviticus and all the blood rituals. Guys, it's a thing. We haven't gotten to that thing yet. But the blood is the life force. Bodily fluids are life force markers. And sacred because it's defining your humanity. Does that make sense? That's why it was such an abomination when it was combined with the spiritual entities. Okay. So once this is shared or released, the human vessel, the Adamic human vessel, is unfit for sacred contact because, well, it's been mixed with someone else. So this is about shared physical space and spiritual space, because sex isn't just physical. I don't care what they want to tell you in 2025. It's covenantal, it's tribal, it deals with inheritance, and it's dimensional, it's energetic. And two become one. So there's this merged resonance that happens. And it's beautiful, but it temporarily disqualifies you from handling holy objects. Sorry, not sorry. All right. So they were about to eat the bread reserved for priests, and they just wanted to know, are they neutral? Are they reset? Are they unsaturated? Can they carry it without residue? And David says, yes, the men are holy. He's declaring their dimensional readiness, not some kind of moral superiority here. This parallels with the thinking in the pagan temple sex cults, but in an inverted way. So the pagan sex temple sexuality versus this Hebrew covenant purity we're going to do this audit and compare the two. So in pagan systems, they believe that sexual energy is sort of a ritual tool, if you will. And this is why in the news, you hear so much about priests and politicians, and your essay and your Epstein shit and what these people are doing. It's not just about the age of the girls or boys, although that's important. Don't get me wrong, okay? It's also about the ritual energy that's happening during these instances, okay? And then we're just going to leave it at that. People are very interested, particularly now in the news, with this whole ritual stuff and sexual energy that is overflowing with everyone in the ruling class, if you will, and the blackmail that's coming from that. Well, I am proposing for you to consider that it is not just about the age, although that matters, and that's another piece to it, and it's a very evil piece to it. But it also has to deal with the blood and the sexual energy. This also plays right into what you're seeing, not so much now, but during the last administration, we had a lot of gender fluidity, and we're just going to leave it at that. Okay. In these pagan temples, we can go deep into the sexuality in the pagan temples. I'm going to have to do that one day for you guys. But it deals with emasculating men. It deals with castrating men. It deals with castrating men to worship the goddess, and to make them the men effeminate. It also deals with having your male concubines appearing more female and utilizing it that way. And the way that you would handle a young man from behind, okay, is said to trigger the Kundalini energy or the spiritual energy, okay? And it's a spiritual awakening process. It's uncoiling the serpent of the Kundalini. It's a whole thing, you guys, back there, I'm telling you. And even with the girls, the orgasmic, the senseless orgasmic euphoria is bringing you closer to the gods, which is why it's so important. It sounds really puritanical to be sexually pure, because today everyone's out throwing the hoochie all over town, and it's like women's rights. No, stop with the hoochies everywhere. Okay, don't stop spreading the hoochies. We want to keep it pure because of the sexuality that's used as a tool to be closer to these gods. The sexual energy invokes these gods, and the blood too, the blood rituals. So they're using this as a ritual tool. And this happens in Mesopotamian, Canaanite, and Greek and Roman temples, which is why they had the temple prostitution. And this was both male and female and all ages, if you will. It was used to invoke these fertility gods, channel divine energy, and merge with the deities themselves. And boy, believe me, those spiritual deities, they want to get their hands on the blood and the fluid. Because why? That's the life force of the Adamic humanity. That's what it is. So all of these rituals in your pagan temples also included these orgies, these festivals, sacred marriage rites, meaning not just marriage covenant with husband and wife, but marriage to divine, these entities. You'll hear in even some of the indigenous places, they have these spirit husbands, if you will, and they're having sexual relations with their spirit husbands. And these shamans are going through these sexual rites and rituals. And the oracle at Delphi, like she was all hopped up on goofballs and like using that sexual energy. And this is also the seasonal fertility thing, guys. It's a whole thing. The pagan sex temple is a whole giant thing. So when you compare that to understanding the covenant sexual energy, just saying it's not a sin. We don't think you're out in pagan temples, but you just want to keep your body your own, right? Get all that fluid and energy back to yourself. Because the covenant scroll sees that sexual energy as a sealed exchange. Sex is not transactional, okay? It's a covenant between man and woman. That's why you become one. You're not spreading it out there. It creates that one flesh resonance, and both parties are supposed to be in the same covenant. Because if you mix the guy, right, with the pagan woman, this is, member of the whole rule about the pagan hoochie, is don't get involved with pagan hoochie because they're going to seduce you to worship other gods, because you're sharing spiritual and sexual covenant space and bodily fluids and intermixing, and you've got a person in one covenant and you've got a person in another covenant, and the two don't mix. One has to override the other in order for them to become one in covenant. Does that make sense? Am I making sense? It's making a dimensional merger that must be honored, which is why you have the beloved wife protocol. We trace this, right? The heir for the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants always born through the beloved wife, like Rachel, Sarah, Mary, not the janky ass wife like Leah. Okay. You've always got the beloved wife. Sometimes they may be pagan like Ruth, but Ruth was in the covenant with her husband, right? They were in the same covenant. So that's okay. If you have someone out of covenant doing some janky ass shit, that's not okay. This is why it's the men carry the covenants, and the womb of the beloved births the heir, not the womb of the janky ass wife. Okay, we talked about this before too. So after sex, even within that covenant, you still have that temporary unclean status because of the bodily fluids, right? So this isn't about shame. It's about humanity and being saturated with someone else's stuff, either spiritually or physically. So the priest's question of have you been with women, it's not about sin and shame. It's about being neutral, okay? When I pull into covenant and I'm working on casting growlers out of someone's space, or I'm working on a healing thing with them, I pull into covenant, and the first thing I do is have to go to neutral. The neutrality is so important to be aligned in that covenant energy of God. Does that make sense? So have they recently been around another vessel? Are they saturated with energy that needs a reset? But a pagan priest would say, instead of have your men been with women, a pagan priest might ask, have you invoked the goddess lately? And have you merged with the quote unquote divine feminine? Boy, we heard that running around the past few years. So that's the difference. But that sexual energy was a really, really, really big deal. All right. So Jesus in the override, he's not invoking any sexual energy. He's overriding it. He honors covenant marriage, but never uses sex as a spiritual tool. His authority comes from dimensional legitimacy, not ritual entanglement. Sexual energy isn't to be used as a tool. It's a covenant exchange. Okay? Only for covenant. So to recap today, so far, we've got our escape meal, which isn't just a snack on the run. This is David's scrollback declaration of tribal alignment, override timing, and kingdom transfer. So we've got our escape meal and the barley harvest, which bring a covenant override. Our barley's the first fruits, which ripens before the wheat during Passover, and then the following Sabbath, which is unleavened bread, unleavened meaning false teaching, among other things. It's the grain of the poor, the humble, and the early responders, those most in need, I think of them as. I think of the barley, not really in a hierarchy, but like Jesus is digging down to the bottom of the barrel and pulling up the ones that are most in need to be responding early. And they're offering the first sheaf. We are aligned, and we move when you move. David's men eating during the same barley season. These are the first fruits of a whole new kingdom order, transferring from Saul to David. He's going to be setting up a whole new kingdom just like Jesus. And the bread of the presence, this is the tribal witnesses. Remember the 12 tribes? Unleavened 12 loaves. David's eating it as his jurisdictional override. He's not stealing it. He's activating realignment through that Ephrathite line. His men are the proto-army of the remnant. They're not rebels. And his escape meal is an Exodus echo, just like Jesus is leading people out of bondage, right? Jesus came to set the captives free. He's leading them out of bondage of both government and priesthood, institutionalized stuff, if you will. Well, so is David. And just like Israel left Egypt with unleavened bread, David flees Saul's regime with the holy unleavened bread. Both are dimensional exits from corrupted systems, and so is Jesus. Both meals happen in haste, but with clarity. This is an Exodus, guys. So David's men are his covenant agents, just like Jesus' disciples are going to be his early barley covenant agents, right? They're not hungry. They're not just hungry. They're ritually clean as well. This isn't random. These men have been called, gathered, and sealed. You see this in 1 Samuel. Jesus is mirroring all of this in Luke as his disciples pick the grain, and he invokes David. This is a covenant override of priesthood law. They're both echoing the Exodus, freedom from corrupt worship, false gods, and false systems. So our barley and our bread, this is Hebrew over, doing a dimensional transfer, new jurisdiction. It's not just a meal. It's saying, both from David and Jesus, the old system is breached, the override covenant is active, and the kingdom's on the move. And you better join us or get the hell out of our way.
Anyone want to finish the game?
Let him spaghetti.
Little pig, little pig!
I just slit my dick down your throat.
You guys, the Davidic Covenant is the whole plot of the Bible. And I hope you might have learned something new today, somewhere picked up a nugget or two. But that's not all. That's just understanding the bread part. All this happened, not only that, but all this happened when David was in the middle of reclaiming the Ark of the Covenant. And we're going to get to that the next time.
Energy. Energy. You cannot fuck with this. Energy. You cannot fuck with this energy. Love the oodles in your chest. All of those who are listening. Don't miss the message, judging me. You cannot fuck with this energy. Energy.